So first question, I mean, what's your perspective on the new government? Does this represent some sort of oligarch revanche? Or can we kind of expect something productive to come from the new government led by new Prime Minister Volodymyr Groysman?
Look, I think to be honest with you, this new government coalition and the new ministers that were appointed, as particularly the Prime Minister, are not as bad as particularly Western media have been saying. To be honest with you, this is Poroshenko's last chance to show that his government can actually deliver the kinds of reforms that Western organizations, Western policymakers are waiting for the government to do, and also the Ukrainian people are waiting for the government to do, to be honest with you. And I think there's a lot of awareness within the Ukrainian government now, among these new officials, that this is really their last stance. And for Poroshenko, this is his last opportunity to show that he only has himself to blame if something goes wrong. You can't blame the Prime Minister anymore, who's against you. You can't blame the Prosecutor General, who's corrupt. The new officials are in some ways handpicked by Poroshenko himself. We know them to be sort of Poroshenko's people, in a sense, to be loyal to him. So now the government cannot deliver the kinds of reforms it has to deliver in a short time period. There'll be nobody else to blame except Poroshenko himself.
But I want to push you on that a little bit. I mean, couldn't they always make the argument that the Rada isn't entirely under their control? And that because of that, I mean, there's always somebody else to blame, isn't there?
Of course, right? But like I said, they have gone through that period already. They blamed the Rada, they blamed the PM, right? Now the coalition is going to be difficult. It's going to be much harder to get the votes they need to push through the reforms. I think on economic reforms that are deeply unpopular because they'll be more painful for the Ukrainian public, they're going to face a lot of opposition. But they have no choice. Ukraine is not a country that can take a lot of risks and chances at this point through political deal making. And I say that because Ukraine is dependent on international institutions. Western countries, we have our own problems, in the US in particular, with the current election cycle, but we're not beholden to international aid and to a particular program of reform. Ukraine is. And if they can't get it done, I think we can't rule out the possibility of there being another protest movement. And I think the government is aware of that. I think the parliament is aware of that. I think the new PM, because he used to be the Speaker of the Parliament, is now in a good position to be able to cooperate with the Parliament, to bring them on board with the government's agenda. So I think Groysman is in a good position to be able to do what he needs to do.
And so you're striking a slightly different tone, not slightly, a pretty big, strikingly different tone from what much of the media, both in the West and really in Ukraine too, has been saying about this new government, is that they're not reformists, that it represents, essentially just a return to, even some have said, the days of Yanukovych. Could you respond to that, kind of explain why you think that it's something entirely different?
I never said this was a reform-minded government.
Okay.
I think the reformers that were here before, like the Minister of the Economy, the Minister of Finance, they're out of government, right? This experiment with having foreigners in government seems to be over for Ukraine. What I'm saying is that at this point, all these people have some history, right? Nobody has clean hands, to say the least. But on the other hand, it is a much more centralized government in terms of its power structure under the president. But that is important and key, not because they're reform-minded, but because now there's nobody else to blame, as I said, because Ukraine has no other choice, right? This is their last chance. So it's not that I think these people are all good or all bad. I think it's much more nuanced than that. I think all of them have sketchy histories, just to put it more mildly. But on the other hand, I think this is an opportunity for them to show that they can, through this more cohesive, centralized, power vertical, that they can do the things they have to do. Like I said, I don't think they want to push these reforms through, but they have no other option.
It's interesting that you use the term power vertical, because some critics have said that the direction Poroshenko wants to take Ukraine is essentially what Russia went through in the early 2000s, to rid the country of oligarch power and establish exactly what you described, a power vertical.
Well, that terminology, I think, can have different meanings. It is used by some to describe Russia, to describe the kind of system that Putin has established under his regime. On the other hand, I think Ukraine is very different from Russia. In Russia, there is no democracy. Elections doesn't mean you have a democracy. Ukraine is a democratic country. It has its problems. It's had many problems. But public officials are actually beholden to public opinion here. They're beholden to civil society, and civil society in Ukraine is very active, as we know. There have been 2 revolutions in this country. We can't imagine that happening in Russia today. So when I use the term power vertical, I don't mean to imply that Ukraine is on a path towards Russia. And I think Poroshenko, despite having his problems, despite being an oligarch himself, is very well aware that his power is not infinite. Because look at what happened to his predecessor. And Putin, for example, doesn't have that kind of example to be afraid of.
And so my next question is, you mentioned earlier that, I mean, there has been this criticism from the West. What effect has that had internally on politicians here in Ukraine, specifically those from the presidential administration, as far as you can see?
Well, I haven't had the kinds of conversations that I would have to have at the higher level to be able to give you a very clear answer to that. On the other hand, I think the current Ukrainian government, from what I can tell, from some of the conversations I have had with people in government, are deeply aware that they have a negative image in the US. And then this stalemate, the political crisis, reflected very badly on Poroshenko. His poll numbers within Ukraine have started to slide quite dramatically. The fact that Poroshenko held on to the Prosecutor General Shokin for as long as he did was not positively perceived at all in the Western media and in the Western government, within the US government specifically. But I think people who know Ukraine in the US government, experts on Ukraine and Russia, more generally understand that it doesn't really matter who is in government now. What matters is what they're able to do. So that's what people are looking for. They're looking for this new government to deliver. And they have a very, very short time frame to do so.
And could you elaborate, I mean, exactly on why the time frame is so short? I mean, why can't we wait, 5 or 10 years for this new generation to kind of fill government more and maybe take it along a slower path of reform?
Well, there's a few reasons why. One is very near-term and very basic. It's that international institutions are not going to release the funds that Ukraine needs unless the Ukrainian government can push through the reform agenda the IMF has prescribed and the Ukrainian government has itself signed on to. So that's in the very near term and the very short term, is that there are certain economic reforms the government has to do, or it could lose out on a lot of money that the Ukrainian government needs to function. And the last thing that Ukraine needs now is a complete economic collapse, because that would make it vulnerable to increased Russian aggression, increased Russian influence, etc. On the other hand, the protest mood of the Ukrainian population is again on the rise. We know this from survey data and polls. So we know the Ukrainians are frustrated. They're fed up with the fact that they don't see their government doing the kinds of reforms that they can actually feel, they can actually see. I would urge, if I had an advisory position in the Ukrainian government, to actually pursue a real investigation to find out who actually killed those on the Maidan. I think this would be and remains a key gap in what the government hasn't been able to do in 2 years. And that has led to a lot of Ukrainian civil society and the Ukrainian public of complete frustration, because people want answers. They want answers to why these people died. Because what did they die for? They died for Ukraine to become a democratic society that integrates into Western institutions. And the first step in that is having a clear criminal process for the people involved in the murders of those innocent people who died in the Maidan. I don't know if that's something the government will be able to do, but I would advise them to take that up as a priority, in addition to the economic reform agenda and the anti-corruption agenda.
And one last question. So you mentioned this sort of attitude, this sense of frustration, this protest sentiment in the Ukrainian people. What's the risk of that leading to something dangerous, or at least something unexpected in the government?
I think it's a good thing that government officials know that their power is not vested with them and their position, but it is vested with the people. And they know that because the previous government was deposed by the people, right? So I think in a place like Ukraine, where you still have these vested interests that you mentioned, where you still have a very corrupt system of governments, you have corruption at the highest level and at the lowest level, right? In a country like this, you need government officials to have a little bit of fear of the people, right? And I think that is a very good thing for Ukraine. The government officials are afraid of what could happen next. They are afraid of a third Maidan. Now, that being said, do I think a third Maidan is coming? No. I actually don't think so. There were some people that were saying that in sort of policy, public discourse, but now that there is a stable government, we'll see what it can do. I think if it can actually have some achievable deliverables for the Ukrainian people, right, on judicial reform and anti-corruption reform, that we don't see government official blocking criminal investigations of political corruption, that we see more transparency in public contracts and things like that, then it doesn't really matter who each government official is loyal to be honest with you. What matters is that they can actually produce the kinds of changes that the people want to see. And I think in Ukraine, we'll see what happens. You know, it's a political system that continues to change on a monthly basis. I think, you know, if you pose the question, how long is this government going to last? Nobody can really answer. But I think they have at least until the fall to deliver some change. And if they don't, they may face early elections. I think that's a real possibility. I don't think another Maidan is, but early elections are.
All right, Elena, well, thanks for taking the time to talk. I appreciate it.
Sure, it was my pleasure.